Well, good evening. Welcome to Seattle First Baptist Church. My name is Reverend Lee Curl-Dove, and I'm one of the pastors here, along with my colleague, Reverend Anita Peebles. And we're so excited to welcome you for this exciting event this evening. Just a couple housekeeping items for you so that you can be comfortable in the space. If you need the restroom, there is a restroom to the back of the sanctuary, just out the doors there. It is all gender, and there's an additional all gender restroom just down the stairs. And then we will also be selling copies of How to End Christian Nationalism this evening. If you do not have a copy, if you have not read it, I highly recommend it, and I think you'll probably want to buy a copy after the lecture this evening. And those will be for sale right outside for $30, and you can pay using cash, check, or credit or debit card. But welcome to Seattle First Baptist Church. We're so glad you're joining us this evening. And now I want to invite Steve Smith up to offer greetings on behalf of the Romney Committee and to introduce our speaker.
And speaking of restrooms, I think this is the most beautiful restroom in Seattle. Yeah. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Amanda Tyler. She's the executive director of the BJC, which is the Baptist Joint Commission on Religious Liberty. The BJC upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting it against establishment by the government. Under Amanda Tyler's leadership, the BJC has been at the forefront of national conversations on religious freedom and preserving democracy. Her legal analysis and advocacy have been featured on major news outlets, and she has testified at the Congress on critical issues, including freedom of religion and the rising threat of Christian nationalism. Amanda is a graduate of Georgetown University and the University of Texas School of Law. She lives in Dallas with her husband and a 10-year-old son. Today's program is proudly sponsored by the Romney Legacy Fund, honoring the life and work of Rod Romney, who was a passionate advocate for the dignity and worth of all people. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Tyler.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. Thank you to the Romney Committee. I have been looking forward to this event for several months now, and so it is wonderful to be with you and to enjoy your hospitality and be in this beautiful space. Some of you might be learning about BJC, or Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, for the first time tonight. And so I do have a presentation here with me tonight. And this first slide just shows all the ways that you can connect with us online at BJC. We are in our 89th year, and our vision is faith freedom for all. We come at our work from a faith-based and specifically a Baptist perspective. Our work is on particularly religious freedom and protecting and defending the separation of church and state in the U.S. context. And we do our work for everyone, not just for Baptists, not just for Christians, not just for other religious people who don't claim a religious faith, because we understand in this web of mutuality that religious freedom depends on protecting everyone's freedom to believe or not to believe. Glad that we have people who share these ideas, which is wonderful. So our work does come out of our Baptist foundation, and I will have different QR codes, so if you have a phone, if you want to look up some of the resources, this one will take you to the BJC's website. We recognize, of course, there are many different expressions of Christianity, but the particular tradition that the BJC comes from is from the Baptist movement. And central to the DNA of what it means to be Baptist is advocating for religious liberty. It comes out of our theological commitment to soul liberty. The idea that every person has because every person was created in the image of God, that every person is free to say yes to God and free to say no to God and free to live with those consequences. And core to that freedom is to be sure that there is no authority, no earthly authority that would come between a person and that person's relationship with God. It started at the very beginning of the Baptist movement. One of the co-founders of Baptists was Thomas Helwys, and he wrote in 1612 in a document called A Short Declaration on the Mystery of Iniquity. This document is thought to be the first defense of universal religious freedom that was written in the English language. He wrote, and I'm updating the language slightly for our modern ears, "For people's religion to God is between God and themselves. The king shall not answer for it. Neither may the king be judge between God and person. Let them be heretics, Muslims, Jews, or whatsoever. It appertains not to the earthly power to punish them in the least measure. This is made evident to our Lord the King by the Scriptures," he wrote. Now, this king was a very specific king, King James I, as in the King James Version of the Bible. And the king did not take very kindly to this message when Thomas Helwys sent it to him personally. And so Thomas Helwys was arrested and imprisoned, and he eventually died in Newgate Prison for his advocacy for religious freedom for all people. And so after Thomas Helwys, we have this very long legacy of Baptists advocating for religious freedom for all. And of course, another famous Baptist is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In a sermon called A Knock at Midnight that he preached as early as 1958, he said, "The church must be reminded it is not the master or the servant of the state, but the conscience of the state." And Dr. King here is speaking to the healthiest relationship between the institutions of government and religion. That is one of independence that allows religious communities to be a prophetic witness to society, neither controlled or controlling the government. So against this backdrop of BJC and a long line of Baptists advocating for religious freedom, 6 years ago, we began to see a growing threat to religious freedom for all people. And we started an initiative called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We recognized this growing threat and that it was increasingly violent, and saw it as the biggest threat to religious liberty for all people in the United States today. So it was very central to this mission of BJC and this long line of Baptists to take on this issue. But as you can see from the name of the initiative, it is an ecumenical movement. And part of our growing understanding of Christian nationalism has been there is a difference between impact and responsibility. Because some of the most dire consequences felt by Christian nationalism are felt by people of color and people who are not Christians and people who share both of those identities. But it is the greatest responsibility to take on the threat of Christian nationalism. That greatest responsibility falls to those of us who are Christians, and particularly to white Christians, because whether we have meant to or not, we have done the most to perpetuate it, and we have benefited ourselves from it in ways that require us to take a more active role. As we started Christians Against Christian Nationalism, one of our first objectives was really to name and understand the threat of Christian nationalism. And I think the words of James Baldwin ring especially true here. He once wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it is not faced." And so it is critical that we face head-on the threat of Christian nationalism. Now, I do want to provide some definitions so that we all have a common understanding of what we're talking about. And I'm going to start first with a definition of religious nationalism. Religious nationalism is a fusion of religious and national identities. And it is a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. I believe that Christian nationalism goes back at least as far as Constantine, when Christianity first got into trouble, because that is when the power of the empire took on the Christian religion for its own and used all the force of that empire to enforce Christianity in different ways that led to the oppression of people who are outside of that locus of power. But we Christians were never meant to be a religion of empire, I believe. Jesus was killed by the empire. Jesus came to upset all of the power structures and preached over and over again that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And all these years later, all of these many centuries since Constantine, we as a people are continuing to reap the consequences of empire appropriating Christianity for its own. While the focus of my lecture tonight is going to be on Christian nationalism in the U.S. context, religious nationalism is not only a problem in the U.S., and we can look around the world today and see many different examples of religious nationalism that is both informing and informed by Christian nationalism in the United States. So I do want to focus on Christian nationalism in the U.S. context. And this is how we define Christian nationalism in our project. That Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities into one. Put another way, Christian nationalism suggests that to be a true American, that one must be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian who often holds certain fundamentalist religious beliefs that are in line with conservative political priorities. Now, just to hold fundamentalist religious beliefs or just to have conservative political priorities does not necessarily indicate Christian nationalism. But to believe that to be a real American that you have to agree with those beliefs, that is an indicator of Christian nationalism. I'll often use the terms Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism interchangeably. And that's because, again, in the U.S. context, we cannot understand Christian nationalism without also grappling with white supremacy and racism. And that's because Christian nationalism both creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that is limited to the very narrow group of people who held power and full rights of citizenship when this country was first founded. That group of people were white, Protestant, Christian men who owned property. A very narrow circle of belonging that left everyone else out with fewer and fewer rights as you went further away from that locus of power and control. So the Christian in Christian nationalism is less about a given theology or a given religion and more about an ethno-national identity, in this case, an identity of whiteness. Christian nationalism in the United States is also a very old problem, and we can look back at our history at different points in time and see them, and I think a particularly clear example of Christian nationalism from our past is the KKK. And not the modern version of it necessarily, which is thankfully a largely fringe organization. But about 100 years ago, the KKK was a very mainstream organization in this country. Millions of Americans belonged to it. And it did have this toxic mix of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and violence that terrorized not just Black Americans, but Jewish Americans and Catholic Americans as well. And so we see in this way that white Christian nationalism is a very old and deep problem in this country. Now, for those of us particularly who are Christians, I think a key piece, and I do write about this in the book, as we look to end Christian nationalism, we must ground ourselves in God's love. And part of that requires us to distinguish Christian nationalism from Christianity. Christian nationalism, put simply, is a form of idolatry. And that's because it merges American and Christian identities into one, confusing our allegiances and confusing who and what we worship. It also is a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus. Jesus, when we read the Gospels, was always on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed, those who were oppressed by power. If I have to sum up Christian nationalism in one word, I would say power. And if I have to sum up Christianity and the teachings of Jesus in one word, I would say love. And so that we have to think about these as two distinct areas that do have some overlap. Some of that is in the symbolism. Christian nationalism uses the language and the symbols of Christianity: crosses, images of a white Jesus, Bible verses, Christian language. So to a casual observer, they can look much like the same thing. And this, I think, is the difficult but necessary piece for those of us, particularly Christians, who are looking to dismantle Christian nationalism. We have to be honest about the ways that American Christianity has been impacted and polluted by Christian nationalism, again, for centuries. And we can look at our history and see the ways that Christianity has sacrificed the gospel of love on the altar to false power for so long. We have to look at our history with very clear and open eyes if we are really going to work to dismantle it. And so just to give a very quick brush through history, I want to point out some different points where we saw this sacrifice of love to power. European Christianity used Christian theology as the foundation of the doctrine of discovery. That's the deadly heresy that it was God's will for European conquerors to steal land and murder the native inhabitants of North and South America. Another piece of a point in time of history was 1667. That's when the established church of the empire, the Anglican Church, was in power in the colony of Virginia. At that time, there was a thorough merger between national and religious identity in that colony. The assembly in the colony of Virginia was composed entirely of white Anglican men. And in 1667, that assembly passed a law that said that baptism would not free an enslaved Native American person of African descent or mixed race background. They sacrificed a key piece of their theology to power and subverted it and succumbed it to this worship of power in the form of chattel slavery. In our own tradition of Baptists, white Baptists in the South chose power over love when they created the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. They claimed that slavery was, quote, an institution of heaven. And in 1863, the Southern Baptist Convention pledged to support the Confederacy in the Civil War. That same false gospel was used to justify Jim Crow segregation and lynching, with church members often members of the KKK as well. And so when we think about the threat of Christian nationalism in our current day, to our democracy, to religious freedom, to an authentic Christian witness, we have to understand just how old of a problem this is. And part of what makes it so difficult is how Christian nationalism has changed in some ways our conception of freedom itself. From a Christian perspective, I think the pinnacle of freedom in the scripture is Paul's letter to the Galatians, and specifically chapter 5 of the letter, starting in verse 1 and continuing in verses 13 and 14. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love, become enslaved to one another. This is the freedom of Christ, a freedom to love, but we have replaced it with the lie of white supremacy, or what Ta-Nehisi Coates has written about as a, quote, white freedom. And I'm going to read from an essay that he wrote several years ago. White freedom is the freedom without consequence, freedom without criticism, freedom to be proud and ignorant, freedom to profit off of people in one moment and abandon them in the next, a stand your ground freedom, freedom without responsibility, without hard memory, a Monticello without slavery, a Confederate freedom, the freedom of John C. Calhoun, not the freedom of Harriet Tubman, which calls you to risk your own, not the freedom of Nat Turner, which calls you to give even more, but a conqueror's freedom, freedom of the strong, built on antipathy or indifference to the weak. This white freedom that Coates writes about is not the freedom of Christ. We have enslaved ourselves and others in service of power. But in order to be set free by Christ, we must reject Christian nationalism, the trappings of power, the lie of white supremacy, and return to the teachings of Jesus. Christian nationalism uses a white Jesus as a mascot for this kind of white power, and it must secure that power through violence. And unfortunately, the deadly manifestations of violence are sadly too many to even list. But the ones that really, I think, speak to most clearly this Christian nationalism and this sense of the false idol of power include the shooting at the Mother Emanuel AME Church, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the shooting at the Walmart in El Paso, at the Top Supermarket in Buffalo, and the insurrection on January 6, 2021. And, this week as we gather, we saw horrific violence. The killing of Charlie Kirk on a college campus, followed with threats to HBCUs, and the killing by ICE of a man during a traffic stop. As Christians, we committed to following Jesus. We must commit to denouncing all of these forms of violence and not just calling out the violence that are inflicted on white bodies and not noting the violence that is happening in our streets every single day. So as we're understanding what Christian nationalism is on a deeper level, not just as Christians, but also as Americans, we have to understand and learn to see what some of these markers of Christian nationalism are. For one, Christian nationalism relies heavily on this mythological founding of the United States as a, quote, Christian nation. The idea, the false idea, the mythology that America was created by Christians in order to further Christianity in law and policy. Often this mythology also suggests a divine providence at hand, the idea that God's providential hand is guiding America through history and to the present day. Sometimes it even suggests that the founding documents themselves were divinely inspired. It often is a cherry-picked version of history that overemphasizes the religious biographies of certain founders while ignoring the more inconvenient facts of others. And in this way, Christian nationalism, again in the U.S. context, works against a theological understanding of how Christianity is a global religion. Our Gospels tell us, for God so loved the world. It doesn't say for God so loved the United States. But Christian nationalism as an ideology sends that message to us over and over again, that God loves the U.S. best, that God has a special plan for the U.S. and God's plan for the world. And so as Christians in a theological way, we must learn to reject this false story. But as Americans, it's also important that we reject this as against constitutional history and the constitutional text. Because far from the founders wishing to set up a Christian nation, they actually made a very deliberate choice to form a secular government and to make a dramatic break with the system that had been in place in most of the colonies, which was a system of established religion. And so my favorite rejoinder when someone makes an argument that the United States is a Christian nation, and this is because I am an attorney, I go straight to the U.S. constitutional text itself. There, of course, is no mention of a Christian nation there. There's no mention of Christianity or of Jesus or of God, even a very generic reference to a deity in the constitutional text. And in the original Constitution, there's only one mention of religion at all, and it's in Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, where it says that there will be no religious tests for public office. And so I say, these founders were very smart men, and if they indeed were trying to set up a Christian nation, not only were they not explicit about it, they actually did it in about the most ineffective way possible by prohibiting religious tests in the very document. So instead of setting up a Christian nation, they actually set up a system where religion would be irrelevant to one's citizenship or standing in American life. Now, the reality of how that has happened and unfolded over the last nearly 250 years since the Declaration of Independence is a very different story, right? And so I think we have to hold these two truths at once. But as far as the constitutional system itself, it was one that was set up to try to protect religious freedom, to encourage religious pluralism, and that is a bedrock piece of Americans' pluralistic democracy that we should all be united in trying to protect and defend, particularly in this very vulnerable moment for pluralistic democracy. As we work to dismantle Christian nationalism, it's also important that we are careful with the language of patriotism and nationalism itself. So I define patriotism as a love of country. And like any love, it cannot be forced if it is to be genuine. It must be freely chosen. One does not have to be patriotic. But if one does have a sense of love of country, there is not one way to show it. There are many different ways to show one's patriotism. Some might be expressive, like waving an American flag. Some might be, or symbolic, some might be more expressive by actually exercising our First Amendment rights, including our rights of free speech and our rights of protest. We can love our country enough to want better for it. So there are many different ways to express one's patriotism. Nationalism, on the other hand, is an allegiance to country that demands supremacy over all other allegiances, including for those of us who are Christians, our allegiances to Jesus. And so, again, because of this merging and submerging of our religious convictions to what the nation might require of us, we also run into theological problems here as Christians. One of Jesus' teachings in the Gospels was to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Implicit in this teaching from Jesus is Caesar is not God, and God is not Caesar. These are two different realms to which we do owe different allegiances. And our allegiances to God and what God wants for our world are higher than what any national power would ask or demand of us. Nationalism tends to mix this up for us. And so a simple question that I like to ask myself is my sense of patriotism causing me to violate my religious convictions? If so, it is not patriotism. It is not a healthy love of country. It has ventured into these unhealthy and dangerous waters of nationalism and should be rejected. I do want to turn very briefly to our current moment and to some of the particular problems that Christian nationalism is harming religious freedom in the United States today. These are just a few examples since January of 2025. One is the violent and dehumanizing immigration policy that is being carried out in American cities and places all across the country right now. And one of those ways that immigration enforcement is the rescission of a policy called a sensitive locations policy, something that had been in place for at least the last 30 years, that said there would not be immigration enforcement in quote-unquote sensitive locations. That includes courthouses and hospitals and schools and houses of worship. And several religious communions, including American Baptist Churches USA, have joined lawsuits that are challenging this rescission of this sensitive locations policy on the grounds that it violates religious freedom. The religious freedom of our religious communities that aren't as free if there is the threat at any moment that immigration enforcement could happen on church property, interrupting services, and otherwise keeping people from coming to worship in person in our houses of worship. We've also seen threats to religious freedom by setting up a so-called task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. This move by the Trump administration sends a signal that Christians are deserving of extra protection by the U.S. government. To state the obvious, I believe, in our Christian majority country, not our Christian nation, but a Christian majority country, there is no rampant anti-Christian bias in this country. And to suggest that there is detracts and denigrates from the very real Christian persecution that is happening in other countries around the world right now, not to mention the much higher rates of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim violence and discrimination and other forms of religious discrimination that are happening to other groups also in this country right now. And so I have a very real fear that this task force, far from protecting Christians in this country, again, Christians that don't need the government's protection in this way, but it will be used to impose a kind of theological conformity that will harm everyone's religious freedom, including other Christians. We also saw just this very week the government try to promote religious exercise. President Trump made a speech on Monday where he called for the government to, quote, bring back religion in America. I was not aware that it had gone anywhere. He said that we should privilege so-called Judeo-Christian principles above all others. And he also directed the U.S. Department of Education to issue new guidance on prayer in schools. All of these moves violate, again, these constitutional principles, many years of Supreme Court precedent, and invites government interference where it does not belong. And I think a quote from, a Virginia Baptist pastor, John Leland, from the late 18th century, is particularly apt here. Leland was a contemporary and a neighbor of James Madison and is thought to have helped influence the inclusion of religious freedom in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Leland wrote, "The fondness of magistrates to foster Christianity has done it more harm than all the persecutions ever did. Persecution, like a lion, tears the saints to death, but leaves Christianity pure. State establishment of religion, like a bear, hugs the saints, but corrupts Christianity and reduces it to a level with state policy." Those words are so apt with what we're seeing now, with a government that is trying to prop up and promote a version of Christianity that actually distorts and corrupts the religion that we practice. Another example from earlier this year was the expansion of the travel ban, again, basing inclusion in this country and immigration policy on religion and ethnicity. It is reminiscent of one of the darkest moments in U.S. history over the past 100 years. That is, of course, the internment of Japanese Americans that I know hit this community in Seattle so profoundly. And this is an issue that is continuing to be present in our day. If we do not understand and learn our history, we will repeat these awful atrocities of history, and they are being repeated in our country today. So having painted this picture, what are we to do? This is what inspired me to write How to End Christian Nationalism, because this is the question that I would continue to get. And so I want to leave us, before we have questions, with some ideas about what we might do. One is that we take on Christian nationalism close to home. And sometimes that begins right in our religious communities. I spoke earlier about how Christian nationalism has been corrupting American Christianity for centuries. None of us are immune from that corruption. And it's so important that we learn to investigate and interrogate how our own understanding of the faith has been influenced by Christian nationalism, even before we were born or were born into the faith for many of us. Where do we see vestiges of Christian nationalism in our symbols, in our liturgies, in our theologies? How can we grow closer to following Jesus and the teachings of Jesus? How do we reject empire in the ways that Christianity has aligned itself with power? How do we learn to love like Jesus taught us to love? This requires us to have conversations, sometimes very difficult, honest, but necessary conversations. Could happen, as I know this church has done, with book studies or a Sunday school series. It could be a community conversation that could be hosted, a sermon series. There's so many different ways for congregations to really delve deeply into these questions. This isn't a one and done. This is not, let's have one conversation about this. This is an ongoing piece that will deepen our faith and therefore also deepen the way that we show up in the world for our neighbors. How do we have these kinds of conversations in our communities with our loved ones? And so some of the ideas I have here are to approach these conversations with a deep sense of humility, of finding our own areas where we have overlooked, where we have sacrificed love to power, to ask questions with a genuine sense of curiosity, to seek to understand, to have empathy. And one just very practical way that I've found to do it, and maybe you've noticed it in the way I've talked tonight, but instead of labeling certain people as Christian nationalists, I talk about Christian nationalism. I think it is a much more accurate way to say that someone might be embracing the ideas of Christian nationalism. Someone might be moving towards Christian nationalism. Christian nationalist rather suggests that this idea is an immutable reality or part of someone's personality and not something that they are choosing to embrace or reject. We all have that choice to do so at any time. And so if you leave with one practical idea, is to start thinking and talking about Christian nationalism and not labeling people, even people who might even try to take on that term themselves, but not to think that anyone could be reduced to a single quality by calling them a Christian nationalist. Another idea that we at BJC are really pursuing right now is encouraging people to organize in local communities to affect change and to work to dismantle Christian nationalism. This particular QR code will take you to a page on our website that talks about what we're doing in these local groups. And this map shows all of the different groups that are currently in formation. We hope to add many, many more places on this map of groups of people who are committed to doing the long-term work of dismantling Christian nationalism in their local contexts. There's this argument sometimes that, Jesus, he wasn't political. Well, I think that Jesus was a political figure in that Jesus was with the people in his community. He was with the people who were marginalized and oppressed for power. He was calling out for justice for them. And that example of what it means to live with and for the people we are in community with should inspire us to do the same, and to do so grounded deeply in our faith. And so the organizing that we are hoping to help support in this effort is very much a faith-rooted organizing. Some of the things that we're doing through the organizing are helping form some agreements, define things for the groups as we try to all work on strengthening civil society. These are groups that are not just gathering, but actually doing a lot of hard work together, committing to do the work for a long term. The faith part of faith-rooted organizing gives us a grounding point. And we are hosting some one-on-one coaching, but also some learning communities for these local group leaders to help people tap into the power of faith-rooted organizing. This work is helping us all move in these communities away from a sense of individualism, a cancer that really infects all of American society, and moving much more into communal action and tapping into the power of the people. These groups are doing hard work of discerning the issues that are most impacting their communities, and then really working towards how do we dismantle these structures that are impacting those in our communities. We already know that there's wonderful organizing happening in communities all across the country. So sometimes the work is just encouraging people to tap into networks that are already moving, but to do so in this faith-rooted posture that helps them work well across all different kinds of difference. One particular area that many of these communities are working on is protecting religious freedom in public schools. And I did include an entire chapter in the book on this issue because we are finding that there's really a concerted effort to push Christian nationalism in public schools. Public schools are laboratories of democracy. It's where our youngest citizens learn to be with people across all different kinds of lines of difference. And some of the areas that we are seeing Christian nationalism in public schools show up in places all over the country. This is a list of some of these places. We're seeing the teaching of this Christian nation mythology in schools in place of a more accurate and honest history of the United States. This term Judeo-Christian values is often a signal of this Christian nation mythology. To be obvious, there is no such thing as the Judeo-Christian religion, and it is a cover for inclusivity that is actually quite exclusive. Of course, it excludes anyone who is not Jewish or Christian, but it also, in using Judeo as a modifier of Christianity, it is not respectful of Judaism as an independent religion. And often the ways that Jewish stories might be told or attempt to be told in some of these curriculum are in ways that are dismissive, inaccurate, and even anti-Semitic in furthering tropes in the way that it is, while claiming to be inclusive of Jewish people. Of course, it is also exclusive of people of other faith traditions, as well as people who don't claim a faith tradition at all. We're seeing some of these ideas put forth in posting of "In God We Trust" in public schools, and now there have been laws passed in 3 different states, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, that will require the posting of the 10 Commandments in public school classrooms, even though there is Supreme Court precedent that is now 45 years old that said that that exact act is unconstitutional. So we see people going directly against Supreme Court precedent, trying to overturn precedent. We see teaching of the Bible in the curriculum, not teaching about religion, but actually trying to indoctrinate particular religious ideas and religious texts in the public schools. We see it with book and content bans, and also the promulgation of school chaplains in public schools, sometimes in the place of mental health counselors. And many of these efforts, as I was reflecting coming here tonight, What has opened the door for many of these opportunities is actually a Supreme Court case that came out of this very area. There was a case at the U.S. Supreme Court a few years ago called Kennedy versus Bremerton, where Coach Kennedy was claimed that he had a First Amendment right to pray out loud at the 50-yard line immediately after public school football games. It was a very exact religious exercise. And the Supreme Court upheld that exercise as his First Amendment free exercise right. I believe that that case has been widely misunderstood, that opinion has been widely misunderstood and misapplied, but to provide license for many of these areas to really push government exercise of religion in public schools and to really push the envelope here. So this is very much an open question. My last appeal to you all, as we all go out and think about how do we work to end Christian nationalism, is just encouraging us all to take our rightful place in the public square. A key idea when we first started Christians Against Christian Nationalism, a value that we upheld, was that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. The image on your right is obviously from January 6, 2021, where we saw these images of Christian nationalism being used on a direct affront on American democracy. In ways that really intensified the violence of that day and turned what was a political cause for many in that crowd into one of religious destiny or religious fervor. The picture on the left is from January 6, 2023, when a group of faith leaders gathered at the U.S. Capitol across the street at dawn to bear witness not just to what happened on January 6th, but to speak publicly to the fact that Christian nationalism was a driving factor in what happened. The reason that we gathered that morning is because the U.S. Congress in the Select Committee on January 6th, even though they took months and months of testimony, even though they sought testimony from many of us on Christian nationalism, did not have the political courage to list Christian nationalism as a factor on January 6th in their 1,000-page report. And so we thought it was incumbent, again, on faith leaders, many of us Christian faith leaders, to speak that into the public square. There's a big difference between Christian nationalism and faith-based advocacy. We can bring our identities, including our faith-based identities, into the public square, but to do so in ways that don't insist that our particular religious views be reflected in law and policy. Morality is not limited to one faith tradition, and common values can unite us against all kinds of differences, including differences of faith. And so we can focus on some of those common values for the way that we order our society while giving necessary freedom for the free exercise of faith where we diverge. That is the calling that I believe we are all called to. And I'm grateful that you all are here tonight to join with us. And so with that concludes the lecture, and I would love to take any questions you all have.
Well, thank you, Amanda. And so now we're going to have a time of Q&A. So if you have a question, you can just raise your hand, and Pastor Anita will bring a mic over to you.
Thank you so much. I don't know if this is it working. I wondered how you felt about the "In God We Trust" on all of our currency in the United States.
Yeah. So when "In God We Trust," I would say that's an example of this kind of civil religion. And often those who are perpetuating Christian nationalism will point to that as this example of, see, we're a Christian nation. We even have this on our currency. We say it, it's our national motto. We say it with our pledge. Well, it helps to learn a little history here, because none of those things were around at the founding of the country. In God We Trust was first added to U.S. currency in the middle of a civil war. And when I think about Christian nationalism, an image that I use often is thinking about high tides of Christian nationalism. It's always there with us, but sometimes we have a high tide. And often it emerges at a time of great insecurity in the culture, insecurity that can often come at times of war. And there's a sense when we're at war with each other to try to claim God for our side. And in that case, it was the U.S. government against the Confederacy, claiming God for the U.S. side and wanting to put In God We Trust on U.S. currency as a way to claim God and God's favor. And so that's where it started. And then we had another high tide of Christian nationalism in the 1950s, in the middle of the Cold War, different kind of war, but a war on communism. And there was an effort to label communism as godless and to label the United States, again, aligning with God. And so that's where In God We Trust became the national motto. I had that one photo of In God We Trust on public schools. Recently, there's been an effort to try to require that a posting of those words in all public schools. But also that was when One Nation Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. And so these are vestiges and examples, I believe, of Christian nationalism, but they're not proof. Well, I mean, we could pass acts of Congress to remove them, but the political, and I think the example that I gave of the Select Committee, it shows that there is not much political will or courage to do so, because there's this concern that somehow they would be labeled as anti-Christian or anti-God were you try to remove those things now. And so this is where I do think there is an opportunity for people of faith to say, actually, that really cheapens my religion, to slap it on American currency or to repeat it without any kind of meaning, or to claim God on the side of oppression or violence. And so I think in a democracy, I'm not saying that it could never happen, but there might be bigger issues that we want to rely on first when we think about it.
Yeah, thank you. Is there anyone else?
I have a question related to the Supreme Court. So I'm not an attorney. What little I understand about the law is that Supreme Court decisions are not reversible in the future. In other words, once the Supreme Court makes a decision, that's it. And everybody has to follow this Supreme Court decision from now until forevermore. And I don't know if this understanding of American law is correct, but if my understanding is true, it does fill me with some despair. I was wondering if you have some thoughts about this?
Well, so Supreme Court precedent, once a case is decided, then that is the law of the land until the U.S. Supreme Court decides something else. And, I think when we look at abortion rights in this country, for instance, we have a case that was law for 50 years starting with Roe versus Wade, that allowed a constitutional right for abortion, that the court with new personnel decided something different. So we've seen that, which for me was incredibly discouraging, because it's the first time in many years we've actually seen rights being taken away, right? And then we can also look to our past in places, for instance, like the Dred Scott decision, right, that was eventually overturned by a different Supreme Court. So there are opportunities for the Supreme Court to make different choices and make different law. what's very concerning to me right now is with the current personnel in the U.S. Supreme Court, we're moving in a direction of taking rights away from people. And in the context of religious freedom, which is really the area that I'm most focused on, the case, for instance, about the posting of the Ten Commandments. There's a case in 1980, the court said, no, you cannot post the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms because that constitutes a government establishment of religion. That is the government selecting one text, one version of a text, and making it an official government document. This has the U.S. government stamp of approval on the Ten Commandments. And that idea is not in line with the U.S. Constitution. And unfortunately, there are people who think that this U.S. Supreme Court would decide that case differently and actually allow that and say that there could be a government-sponsored religion. They're actively trying to get that case to the U.S. Supreme Court right now. So in some ways, I'm giving you hope that law can be changed, but in other ways, it's not looking very hopeful right now with the current personnel on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, I want to say, when I was a little kid in the early 50s, I remember learning the Pledge of Allegiance in school, and it was one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next thing you know, they changed it, and they inserted one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. And here I am, about a 10-year-old kid. I'm going, how come they did that? I learned the old way, and now I got to learn it new. And why did they do that? So that's, I didn't think it was, even at that time, I didn't think it was right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a great example of, again, the imposing of Christian nationalism in a way to try to, again, claim God for our own in ways that are very harmful to a sense of inclusion and pluralism in U.S. democracy.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I have a question that might be convoluted, but I don't know if you've read the book, The Racial Muslim. It's by Sahar Aziz.
Yeah, I went to law school with her, actually.
Oh, she's amazing.
Yeah, she is.
I really appreciate what you said about the Judeo-Christian tradition sometimes, marginalizing Jewish people because it appropriates that identity. But also, in her book, The Racial Muslim, Sahar Aziz talks about how we can't just be talking about, this isn't a correction of you, but just it's not. But she urges us not to just talk about religious freedom, but also combating anti-Black racism, because she says if we merge Judeo-Christian and include Muslim, there's still going to be the racial discrimination. And I was wondering how you've, I noticed you talked about the white supremacist Christianity, or white nationalism. I'm wondering how your frameworks address specifically including Black people and the humanity of everyone. So, yeah, I don't know.
Thanks. So it's interesting you talk about Sahar Aziz. I actually interviewed her for my book. And, in writing a book, I've only written this one book, very interesting experience because my own views were refined in the writing of the book. And I remember having this particular conversation with her about that really questioned, and some of, because there's a lot of triumphalism about American history, and including American constitutional history. And being a constitutional lawyer myself and going to law school is just, there a lot of idealization of what I think in the U.S. Constitution. And she really challenged me in a conversation we had to think about how, yes, the founders had a good framework for religious freedom, but they actually weren't creating a system that included, or they didn't mean to include, everyone, right? And that those rights have had to be fought for by justice movements over many years and are continuing, as we're seeing right now, to be fought for. And another piece that changed in the writing of my book, my first draft had kind of a standalone chapter on white supremacy and racism. And the more I worked on it, I thought, actually, you cannot understand any of this without having a continuing conversation, deeper levels of understanding white supremacy and racism. And I absolutely believe that. And because of all of the atrocities that have been committed in this country and continue to be committed in this country, I think it just takes an incredible sense of discipline and for all of us, particularly white Americans, to continue to interrogate the systemic issues that everything is built on. And so I guess in answer to your question, the way of my thinking about this and the modeling is that we can't understand Christian nationalism apart from white supremacy. And yes, it's anti-Black racism, but it's also anti-Latino, anti-Indigenous, anti-Asian American, like every group. And I try to include some examples of that in the book. Of course, it's a short volume. We can't go, very deeply into it. But I think that's why we're also seeing in our current context these continuing issues of attacking diversity, equity, inclusion programs, for instance, the immigration policies, also anti-LGBT policies, that all of this is kind of one fabric, and that we cannot understand this without understanding how whiteness and perpetuating these ideas is core to this ideology.
One here and then here.
You mentioned many of the big manifestations of Christian nationalism today, and yet you called us to a certain humility and curiosity in approaching people, not labeling them. But it's tough nowadays to do that, and if you just elaborate a little bit more, I mean, when we see manifestations every day, and particularly this week in the death of Charlie Kirk, those who've embraced such ideology or idolatry, as you said, and were not to call it out? More specifically? Or?
Yeah, so thanks for the clarifying question. So it's not that we don't call out the problem, but we can also call certain people to account, but we don't label people as Christian nationalists. It's a subtle difference, but just as for the same reason that we call out and understand racism, but it's not all that helpful or, I think, accurate to only label certain people as racists. For one thing, it lets us ourselves off the hook in ways that to live in our system means that we have absorbed and for many of us at different points, perpetuated racism ourselves. And so I think by calling it Christian nationalism, it also gives us room for ourselves to understand how have we perpetuated these, often without intending or even noticing that we've done it, but it creates more space for that. But there are, of course, examples. I mean, just this week, someone who's been in the news a lot, who lives not that far from here, much closer to you than to me in Dallas, is Pastor Doug Wilson, who is in Idaho and who has been on news programs recently actively calling for theocracy in this country, saying that only Christians should hold elective office. Again, directly against the U.S. Constitution, saying that all of law and policy should be based on an interpretation of the Christian scriptures that reflects his views, right? This is someone who is clearly embracing Christian nationalism and calling on a movement that would replace pluralistic democracy with authoritarian theocracy. I have no problem, calling him out as someone who's perpetuating Christian nationalism. And we can do that without using the terms Christian nationalist in ways that I think just kind of lead to this, kind of focus on the most extreme examples that don't leave a lot of room for the rest of us to really grapple with how are we in our own communities continuing to perpetuate it, and where are there places, not just kind of going after the most extreme examples, but where are there places of people in our community that we could have really honest conversations and work over time to try to dismantle this ideology and its hold on all of us, not just the most extreme figures out there.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So I see Brooke and then Sue.
Thank you for raising the wondering about what is God's and what is Caesar's. So I've just paid my 3rd quarter estimated federal tax. And I wonder, what is God's and what is Caesar's? Please say anything else you might about that.
Well, I have written about this, and, I think part of what I understand Jesus' teaching in that, and of course, the context for that teaching is that people were trying to trap Jesus, because to say, the question they raised is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? And it was a trap, because to say, yes, it's lawful, would risk his credibility with the people that he was living with. And to say, no, it's not lawful, would open him up for a treason and would take him out of ministry altogether. And so his answer was, whose head is on this coin? Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And so, I think applying that to our modern context, my interpretation of that is a realization that, yes, we do live in an earthly context, that we have obligations, but we also, our ultimate obligation are the commandments and the laws that God gives us. And Jesus, of course, summed up all the law of the prophets into love God, and a second one like it, love neighbor. And so how do we then follow God's law, which is to love God and love neighbor, while also understanding that in order to do that, that we have certain obligations to our earthly society, but not to get those mixed up, and not to put our obligations to our earthly, systems over our ultimate obligation to love God and love neighbor. And that those things may come into conflict. And when they come into conflict, I believe Jesus is telling us to love God and love neighbor. Even if, and this is, I think, the moment that we all find ourselves in, when we are in a country that is moving towards authoritarianism in a way that doesn't show love for neighbor. How do we reconcile those? And that, I think, is left up to all of us living in community, to how do we really support and live out our ethical and religious obligations in the midst of the society. Jesus doesn't tell us how we figure all of that out, and so I think those are the things that we grapple with. But that's how I understand that teaching. But I think core to it is that God is not Caesar and Caesar is not God. And right now we have a lot of rhetoric that mixes all of that up in ways that make it harder for us to really sift out what our obligations are.
I saw Sue.
This might be a complicated question, but I've been trying to understand the Federalist Society. Are they steeped in Christian nationalism?
So I think that there are examples. So the Federalist Society, if you all know, is a conservative legal society that's been around for many years, that perpetuates its own kind of ideology. It's kind of steeped in this idea of quote-unquote originalism. Originalism is a legal theory that is not very, I think, honest about its It claims to have that. Here's how I think about the question. I think about kind of an analog of originalism to fundamentalism in a religious context. So fundamentalism claims that there is one correct reading of the Bible, and those who are putting that forward, they claim to know what that one correct reading of the Bible is, right? It's often a very literal reading, but literal in whatever translation that they've chosen, and it can often be quite cherry-picked, right, in order to come up with this particular interpretation. But it, like other interpretations, is an interpretation of the Bible. That's what I think is not intellectually honest about fundamentalism or originalism. Originalism also claims that they're just plain reading the text, and they're trying to interpret the text of the U.S. Constitution in the way that it was originally written. But in doing so, it makes interpretive choices along the way as well. And so in that case, in that way, I see some kind of intellectual analogs between some of Christian nationalism and the Federalist Society. And then we also, the modern head of the Federalist Society, I think, does have some of these leanings of embracing Christian nationalism and some ties to this broader network of Christian nationalism, particularly the money behind the Christian nationalist movement, which is different than the ideology that I was mostly talking about tonight. So that's my quick answer to what is a complicated question.
Great. Well, thank you for being here, everyone, and thank you for your questions. And thank you, Amanda. It was a lovely evening, and we're so thankful for your presence here and for the important work that you do every day and the important work that BJC does. So thank you. And Amanda will be right outside the sanctuary there to sign books. And we do have books for sale. So if you do not have a copy, haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And she will be out there to sign books if you buy one or to sign it if you brought one. So thank you, everyone.